Somewhere beneath the Sahara, half buried in dust older than any alphabet, there is a footprint pressed into stone. Not a fossil of claw or hoof, but 5 toes and arch a heel. A human foot frozen mid-stride in volcanic ash that hardened 3.5 million years ago. No one knows where that walk was going. No one knows if it ever arrived. The ash simply remembers the weight, the warmth, the pause, and then nothing. Just silence and centuries folding over it like pages no one turns. Something older than curiosity, older than language pulled you toward this moment. Maybe it was the hum of a question you have carried for longer than you realize, a rhythm buried beneath the noise of your day, beneath the schedules and the screens. A rhythm that does not belong to clocks, it belongs to stone, to the slow memory of rivers cutting through rock, to the ancient patience of continents drifting apart in darkness. You felt it, even if you could not name it, and it brought you here. Now let me ask you something that may change the way you see everything behind you and everything ahead. What if human civilization is not a line stretching forward into infinity, but a circle? What if empires, languages, and entire species of thought have risen before, left their shadow on the earth, and returned to ash without anyone remaining to remember them? What if we are not the first to build, to wonder, to reach for the stars? And what if we will not be the last tonight we walk along that circle? Not with urgency, but with the slowness of dust settling on a forgotten shelf. We will trace the memory the earth keeps in bone, in sediment, in silence, long after the ones who made it have gone. Stay with me. Let's drift a little deeper. There is a place on this planet where no human voice has echoed for 11,000 years. It sits deep in the interior of Borneo, beneath a canopy so dense that rain takes 7 full minutes to fall from the highest leaf to the forest floor. Not because the distance is so great, though it is, but because the water must negotiate its passage downward through an architecture of living things. It slides along the curve of a bromeliad leaf, pulls in the crook of a strangler fig's elbow, beads along a strand of spider silk thinner than thought, and trembles there for a moment as if uncertain whether to continue. Then it lets go, strikes the ground, which is not really soil at all, but 1,000 years of composted leaves, insect wings, fungal threads, and the dissolved calcium of ancient snail shells, and it vanishes without a sound. That is how quiet it is down here. Not the silence of absence, not the silence of a room after everyone has left, but the silence of presence of so many living things breathing at once, that the sound becomes a texture, a pressure against the skin you cannot name but can absolutely feel. The hum of 10 million insects merges into a single sustained tone like a note held on a cello so long it stops being music and becomes weather. Beneath that, the slow creak of wood expanding in humidity, and beneath even that the faint, almost subsonic vibration of roots pulling water upward through capillary channels, a sound no human ear can detect but the body registers anyway, somewhere below the ribs, in the place where unease and wonder sit so close together they become the same thing. The air itself is not empty here. It is thick with moisture weighted with the exhalation of 1 trillion leaves, and it smells of iron and sweetness of decomposition, so advanced it has crossed back over into something almost perfumed. There is a warmth that does not come from the sun because the sun has not touched this ground in a very long time. This warmth rises from below, from the slow metabolic furnace of decay, where bacteria break down a single fallen tree over the span of 40 years, releasing heat so gradually that the temperature of the forest floor holds steady at 26 degrees Celsius day and night, season after season. The forest does not fluctuate. It remembers its temperature the way stone remembers pressure. Above the forest rises in layers that most human eyes will never separate. The understory barely lit where palms spread their fronds like open hands catching coins of scattered light. The mid-canopy dense and competitive where branches from neighbouring trees reach toward each other and then retreat, maintaining gaps so precise that biologists have given the phenomenon a name, crown, shyness, as if even trees understand the necessity of boundaries, and then the emergent layer where the tallest giants break through into open sunlight, their crowns alone hosting ecosystems more complex than entire temperate forests. But you're not up there tonight. You're down here on the floor in the dark, where things begin and where things end, and where the difference between the two dissolves into chemistry. The floor of an old-growth rainforest is not cluttered or chaotic. It is surprisingly bare, almost ceremonial in its emptiness because everything that falls here is consumed. A leaf touches the ground, and within 48 hours fungi have begun to thread through its cells. Within a week it is translucent. Within a month it is gone, returned to nitrogen, carbon, water, and the slow, quiet alphabet that feeds the roots that feed the trees that will one day drop their own leaves in turn. Erosion is time thinking, and down here time thinks constantly. Nothing is wasted, nothing is forgotten. Every atom is archived, recycled, rewritten into the body of something new. The calcium in your bones, tonight, the very calcium holding you together as you lie still and listen, was once part of a shell, and before that a coral, and before that a microorganism drifting in a Devonian sea 400 million years ago. You are not separate from this forest, even if you have never set foot inside one. You are made of its materials, assembled from the same ancient inventory of elements that has been circulating through living and non-living things since the planet first cooled. Your body is a letter written in an alphabet older than language, older than memory, older than bone itself. And tonight that letter is being read aloud by the rhythm of your own breathing, slow and steady, pulling in air that has passed through the lungs of creatures whose names were never spoken, because no one existed yet to speak them. Now let the scene shift, not suddenly, because nothing tonight will be sudden, but slowly the way fog rolls across a lake at dawn. Leave the heat behind, leave the green, let the temperature fall 30 degrees 2010 below zero, until the air becomes sharp and crystalline, almost brittle against the inside of your throat. You're no longer in the tropics. You're standing on Antarctic ice, a sheet so vast it holds 70% of all the fresh water on Earth, frozen into a single body stretching 14 million square kilometers. If it were to melt and one day at will the oceans would rise 60 meters, and coastlines you think of as permanent would become memories buried under salt water. But tonight it is solid, tonight it is still, and it is speaking if you know how to listen. Ice cores drilled from deep within the sheet contain air bubbles trapped hundreds of thousands of years ago, each one a tiny archive of the atmosphere as it once was. Scientists read them the way archaeologists read pottery shards extracting whispers of temperature, carbon dioxide, volcanic eruptions, even the dust blown from deserts that no longer exist. At 2,000 meters down, you find air breathed during the last ice age. At 3,000 meters, the air is older than any civilization. Gravity is memory, and the deeper you go, the heavier that memory becomes. There is something almost sacred in this, a record kept not in words or carved stone, but in frozen breath. The planet has been exhaling for billions of years, and some of those exhalations are still here, locked in crystal waiting. Not waiting for us specifically, because the ice does not care whether we read it or not. If we vanished tonight, every last one of us, the ice would continue to accumulate layer upon layer, recording an atmosphere with no one left to analyze it. The data would persist. The story would still be written. It would simply have no reader. And this is the truth the atmosphere whispers. Whether you hear it in the hum of a rainforest or the silence of a glacier, the Earth does not narrate for our benefit. It narrates for its own. We are listeners who arrived late and who will leave early guests at a performance that began long before we found our seats and will continue long after we have gone. So tonight, let yourself feel that largeness, not as something frightening, but as something that holds you, the way a forest floor holds a fallen leaf, the way ice holds ancient air, the way silence holds every sound that ever was and every sound still waiting to be made. You are inside the atmosphere of deep time now. Let it settle around you like dust in a cathedral, and let us move deeper still. The Earth keeps records the way the old do not in filing cabinets or digital clouds, but in layers, in sediment and stone, in the chemistry of shells, in the magnetism of cooled lava in the width of tree rings, and the isotopes locked inside polar ice. These records are not written for us. They are not organized for convenience. They are buried, compressed, folded, sometimes shattered by the very forces that created them. And yet, if you learn to read them, if you slow yourself down to the pace at which they were written, they will tell you things no human witness was alive to see. They will tell you what the air tasted like 300 million years ago. They will tell you where the continents were sitting when the first forests grew. They will tell you about oceans that opened and closed like slow-breathing lungs over spans of time so vast that the word ancient feels like an understatement. The evidence is there, all of it pressed into the body of the planet like memories pressed into muscle. You just have to know where to look, and more importantly, you have to be willing to accept what you find. Start with the simplest thing, a rock. Not a dramatic rock, not a boulder split by lightning, or a cliff carved by glaciers, but a small, unremarkable piece of sedimentary stone you might find in a riverbed or a roadside cut. Hold it in your mind. Feel its weight, its coolness, the faint grit of its surface against your fingertips. That rock is a compressed chapter of time. Each grain within it was once part of something else, a mountain that eroded a seabed that lifted a desert that blew across a continent, no longer in the same position it occupies today. Geologists call this provenance the origin story of a grain of sand, and tracing it can take you back hundreds of millions of years through landscapes that would be unrecognizable to modern eyes. A single pebble in your hand might contain quartz weathered from a volcanic range that existed before the Atlantic Ocean, opened feldspar from a continental collision that built mountains taller than the Himalayas, and zircon crystals so old they predate multicellular life entirely. The evidence is not dramatic. It accumulates the way dust accumulates on a shelf no one touches, slowly, silently, and with a patience that makes human urgency look almost comical. Then there are the fossils, and not the ones you see in museums mounted and lit and labelled with neat placards. The real fossils are subtler than that. They are impressions of leaves so faint you might mistake them for stains. They are the trace marks of worms burrowing through mud that hardened into shale 400 million years ago. They are the chemical ghosts of bacteria preserved not as shapes, but as shifts in carbon ratio signatures so delicate that only mass spectrometers can detect them. Life has been writing itself into rock since the Archean Eon over 3.5 billion years ago, and the earliest entries in that record are almost invisible. They are layered structures called stromatolites built by cyanobacteria that stacked thin films of sediment and organic material into mounds one microscopic layer at a time over thousands of years. Some of these structures still grow today in shallow bays in Western Australia, living relics of the oldest continuous biological process on the planet. When you look at a stromatolite, you're not looking at a fossil in the traditional sense. You are looking at a habit, a behaviour, a rhythm, repeated so many times that it became stone. You are looking at evidence that life does not need intelligence or complexity to endure. It only needs repetition, patience, and time. The ocean floor holds its own library, and it is arguably the most complete one on the planet. Sediment drifts down through the water column constantly, a slow rain of dead plankton, volcanic ash, cosmic dust, and the dissolved minerals of eroded continents settling on the seabed at a rate of roughly 1 centimetre per 1,000 years. That means a core of ocean sediment 10 metres long represents 1 million years of uninterrupted record. Within that core, scientists can read the temperature of ancient seas by analysing the ratio of oxygen isotopes in the shells of foraminifera, microscopic creatures that lived and died in the surface waters above. They can track volcanic eruptions by finding layers of ash. They can identify periods of extreme cold by the presence of ice-rafted debris stones dropped onto the seafloor by melting icebergs thousands of kilometres from any coast. The ocean remembers everything that falls into it, and unlike human memory, it does not edit, does not select, does not decide what is important. It simply collects, compresses, and holds, building a record so detailed and so continuous that it puts every archive humanity has ever constructed to shame. Our oldest libraries are a few thousand years old. The ocean floor has been keeping records for nearly 200 million years without interruption. And then there is the ice, which we touched in the last chapter, but which deserves to be considered again here, because ice is not just a container of old air. It is a clock, a thermometer, and a chemical diary all at once. Each annual layer of snowfall in Antarctica or Greenland compresses into a distinct band of ice, and within that band are trapped not only air bubbles, but also particles of dust, traces of sulfuric acid, from volcanic eruptions, pollen grains blown from continents thousands of kilometres away, even the fallout from nuclear tests conducted in the 1950s, a sharp chemical spike that appears in ice cores from both poles simultaneously and serves as one of the most precise time markers in the entire geological record. The longest ice cores stretch back 800,000 years, encompassing 8 full glacial cycles, 8 slow expansions of ice sheets across the northern hemisphere, followed by 8 retreats, 8 periods of warming that melted coastlines and flooded valleys, 8 turns of a wheel so large and so slow that no single human lifetime could ever perceive its motion. The evidence is not loud. It does not announce itself, it does not argue or persuade. It simply exists, layer upon layer, patient and indifferent, offering its testimony to anyone willing to descend slowly enough to hear it. What all of this evidence tells us when taken together is something both humbling and strangely beautiful. The Earth has been changing continuously for 4.5 billion years, and it has recorded nearly every change in its own body. Continents have wandered, oceans have appeared and vanished, atmospheres have been rewritten by the metabolic exhaust of microbes, ice ages have come and gone like slow tides on a cosmic shore, and through all of it, through every catastrophe and every quiet century, the planet has kept writing. It has never stopped. It does not know how to stop. The record is not complete, of course. There are gaps, silences, pages torn out by erosion or subduction, or the sheer crushing weight of time. But even the gaps are evidence of something. Even the absences speak. And what they say, if you listen carefully enough, is that nothing on this planet has ever been permanent, that every chapter eventually gives way to the next, and that the very ground beneath you is not solid in the way you imagine, but is instead a slow, breathing archive of everything that has ever been and everything that has already been forgotten. The evidence does not shout, it whispers, and tonight it is whispering to you. Every science begins with order. You gather your data, you sort your layers, you build your timelines, and for a while everything behaves. The sediment tells a consistent story, the isotopes fall into predictable ratios, the fossils appear where they should, in the sequences they should, following the slow logical progression that evolution and geology have written together over billions of years. And then just when the picture seems clear, something appears that does not fit. A data point that refuses to sit where it belongs, a measurement that contradicts the ones around it, a structure, a signal, a chemical signature that should not be there, not in that layer, not at that depth, not at that age. Scientists have a word for this. They call it an anomaly. And anomalies are not errors to be dismissed. They are cracks in the wall of certainty, and what seeps through those cracks is almost always more interesting than the wall itself. Consider the geological boundary known as the Younger Dryas, a period roughly 12,800 years ago, when the Earth, which had been steadily warming after the last ice age, suddenly plunged back into near-glacial cold. It happened fast, not over millennia, but over decades, perhaps even years. Ice cores from Greenland show the temperature dropping by as much as 10 degrees Celsius within a single human lifetime, a shift so abrupt that it would have been catastrophic for any civilization relying on predictable seasons, stable coastlines, and the slow rhythm of agriculture that was just beginning to take root in several parts of the world. The warming had been consistent. The retreat of the ice sheets had been orderly. And then, without obvious warning, the pattern broke. The planet exhaled cold again, as if it had changed its mind. What caused it remains a subject of intense debate. Some researchers point to a sudden flood of fresh water from a collapsing glacial lake into the North Atlantic, disrupting the thermohaline circulation that distributes heat across the globe. Others have proposed a cosmic impact pointing to a layer of nanodiamonds, iridium and magnetic spherules found at the boundary layer in sites across North America, Europe, and the Middle East, materials typically associated with extraterrestrial collisions. The evidence is not conclusive. The arguments continue. But the anomaly itself is undeniable. Something interrupted the expected order of things, and the world changed because of it. Now pull the lens back further to a much older and much stranger anomaly. Around 540 million years ago, something happened in the fossil record that paleontologists call the Cambrian explosion. For billions of years before this moment, life had been almost entirely microbial, single-celled, slow invisible to the naked eye. And then in a span of perhaps 20 million years, which is brief by geological standards, nearly every major animal body plan that exists today appeared in the fossil record almost simultaneously. Eye shells, legs, jaws, segmented bodies, spinal cords, all of it emerging in a burst of creativity so sudden and so varied that Darwin himself called it an inexplicable mystery, one that troubled him deeply because it seemed to contradict the gradual incremental process his theory predicted. We have better explanations now: rising oxygen levels, new ecological niches, an evolutionary arms race between predators and prey. But the anomaly still carries a certain weight. It reminds us that life does not always change slowly. Sometimes it leaps, and the leap rewrites everything that follows. There are smaller anomalies too, quieter ones, the kind that do not make headlines, but that linger in the minds of researchers long after the papers have been published. There are ancient maps, the Piri-Reis map of 1513 among them, that appear to depict coastlines with an accuracy that should not have been possible given the navigational tools available at the time. There are megalithic structures scattered across the world, from Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, built 11,600 years ago by people we assumed were simple hunter-gatherers, to the precisely cut and fitted stones of Sacsayhuaman in Peru, whose joints are so tight that a knife blade cannot be inserted between them, constructed with techniques that modern engineers still debate. These are not proof of lost civilizations in the sensational sense. They are not evidence of aliens or Atlantis, but they are evidence of gaps in our understanding, places where the story we tell ourselves about human progress, a neat line from primitive to advanced, from simple to complex, from ignorance to knowledge, does not quite hold. The anomaly is not the structure itself. The anomaly is our inability to explain it fully within the framework we have built. And perhaps this is the most important thing about anomalies. They do not destroy knowledge, they deepen it. They are not threats to science, but invitations. Every major revolution in our understanding of the world has begun with something that did not fit. Continental drift was an anomaly before it was accepted, a wild idea that the continents moved, dismissed for decades, until the evidence became overwhelming. The microwave background radiation that confirmed the Big Bang was an anomaly. At first, a persistent hiss in a radio antenna that two engineers initially attributed to pigeon droppings. Dark matter is an anomaly, right now a gravitational signature that accounts for roughly 27% of the universe's mass energy content, and yet has never been directly observed. We know it is there because the galaxies do not rotate the way they should without it. The math does not work. The pattern breaks. And in that break, in that uncomfortable gap between expectation and observation, the next chapter of understanding waits to be written. When we apply this thinking to the history of life on Earth, and to the history of our own species, the anomalies begin to multiply. Why did Homo sapiens, anatomically modern for at least 300,000 years, spend the vast majority of that time living in small nomadic groups with minimal technological change, and then suddenly within the last 10,000 years accelerate into agriculture, cities, writing industry and space travel? What triggered that acceleration? And could it have happened before in a form we have not yet recognized? Why do flood myths appear in the oral traditions of cultures separated by oceans and millennia cultures that had no contact with one another, describing cataclysms so similar in structure that the parallels feel less like coincidence and more like convergent memory? These are not questions with easy answers. They are anomalies, cracks in the smooth surface of the story we tell about ourselves, and the temptation is always to smooth them over, to explain them away, to fit them into the existing framework, even when they resist. But the honest response to an anomaly is not to force it into place. The honest response is to sit with it, to let it unsettle you, to allow the discomfort of not knowing, to open a space where a deeper understanding might eventually grow. Tonight, as the weight of the day continues to dissolve, and your thoughts begin to soften around the edges, let the anomalies rest beside you without resolution. You do not need to solve them. You do not need to choose a side. You only need to notice that the story of this planet and of our species within it is not as tidy as we once believed. There are cracks in the record places where the light of the unknown seeps through, and those cracks are not flaws. There are openings. They are where the next chapter begins. And the Earth, patient as it has always been, is in no hurry to reveal what lies on the other side. There are places in the geological record where the story simply stops. Not because nothing happened, but because whatever happened left no trace that we have yet been able to find. These are the silences, the gaps between layers where time passed, but left no fossil, no ash, no chemical signature, no imprint of any kind. Geologists call them unconformities, and they are among the most haunting features in the study of Earth's history. An unconformity is not an empty page. It is a page that was written, read, and then erased by the very forces that wrote it. Erosion, subduction, metamorphism, the recycling of crust back into the mantle. All of these processes destroy evidence as efficiently as they create it, and so the record we hold, as vast and detailed as it is also incomplete in ways we can never fully measure. We do not know what we have lost. We only know that we have lost something because the layers on either side of the gap do not connect. The story jumps, and in that jump, centuries or millennia or entire geological ages vanish without explanation. Think of it this way. Imagine a library so old that some of its books have not merely been removed from the shelves but have been dissolved, their ink returned to water, their pages returned to pulp, their bindings returned to dust. You can see the spaces where they once stood. You can measure the width of the gap, but you cannot reconstruct what was written inside them, because the information itself has been recycled into the raw material of other books that now sit elsewhere in the library, unaware of what they consume to exist. That is what an unconformity is. It is a silence that speaks not of nothing, but of something so thoroughly reclaimed by the planet that only its absence remains. An absence in geology, as in life, is its own kind of evidence. It tells you that the Earth is not a passive archive. It is an active editor, constantly revising, constantly overwriting, constantly deciding without intentional consciousness what will be preserved and what will be returned to the furnace of creation. The most famous of these silences is the Great Unconformity, a gap in the rock record that appears on nearly every continent and spans as much as 1 billion years of missing time. Below the gap you find ancient Precambrian basement rock, crystalline, and metamorphose the deep bones of the planet. Above it you find Cambrian sediments teeming with the first complex animal fossils. But between them there is almost nothing. 1 billion years of Earth's history gone. Not hidden, not buried deeper, simply absent. What happened during that vast stretch of time? There must have been mountains that rose and eroded. There must have been seas that advanced and retreated. There must have been life, though. In what form and at what complexity we can only guess. All of it was stripped away, scraped clean by glaciers, or dissolved by chemistry, or carried into the mantle by tectonic forces, leaving behind a contact surface so sharp and so widespread that it has puzzled geologists for over a century. Some researchers now believe that the Great Unconformity was caused by the global glaciations known as snowball Earth events, when ice sheets may have covered the planet from pole to equator, grinding the surface down to bare rock and washing the debris into the oceans. If true, then the silence was not gentle. It was violent, thorough, and planetary in scale, but we cannot be certain. The evidence that would confirm or deny it is precisely the evidence that was destroyed. Human history has its own silences, smaller in scale, but no less significant in what they conceal. We know that anatomically modern humans have existed for at least 300,000 years, yet our written records stretch back only about 5,000. That means roughly 98% of human experience is unrecorded in any script or symbol system we can read. We have artifacts, stone tools, cave paintings, carved figurines, burial sites, with arrangements that suggest ritual and belief. But we do not have their words. We do not have their stories. We do not know what they called the stars, or how they explained thunder, or what songs they sang to their children in the dark. All of that is silence, not because it did not exist, but because it was carried in memory and voice, and memory and voice do not fossilize. The oral traditions of the world are vast and ancient, but they are also fragile. A single broken chain of transmission, one generation that fails to pass the story to the next, and thousands of years of accumulated knowledge can vanish in a single lifetime. We will never know how much has been lost this way. We only know that the loss is real because the gaps in our understanding of our own past are too wide and too consistent to be explained by anything other than erasure. And perhaps this is the deepest lesson the silence has to offer. The record of life on Earth, including our own chapter within it, is not a complete manuscript. It is a palimpsest, a surface written and erased and written again so many times that the original text is beyond recovery. We build our understanding on what survives, and what survives is always a fraction of what once existed. This does not make our knowledge false. It makes it humble. It reminds us that every conclusion we draw is drawn from incomplete data, that every timeline we construct has holes we cannot see, and that the confident story we tell about the past is always at its edges bordered by silence. Tonight, let that silence settle around you, not as emptiness, but as depth. It is not the absence of meaning. It is meaning compressed beyond the reach of language, held in the body of the planet like a breath drawn in and never released. The silence is not nothing. The silence is everything we have not yet learned to hear. Close your eyes a little more deeply now, and let the mind do what it does best in the dark. Imagine a time before the pyramids, before Mesopotamia, before the first scratches of writing pressed into wet clay. Go further back, past the invention of agriculture, past the last ice age, past the point where our textbooks grow thin and cautious, and begin replacing facts with phrases like "it is believed" and "evidence suggests." Keep going. 10,000 years, 20,000, 50, 100,000 years before the present, and you're standing in a world that is fully human, in every biological sense, populated by people with the same brain volume, the same vocal anatomy, the same capacity for language and abstraction and grief and wonder that you carry tonight. They are not primitive versions of you. They are you born into different weather. And the question that haunts the silence we just passed through is this: what did they build? What did they know? And why do we assume the answer is nothing? The conventional story of human civilization is a story of recent ignition. For most of our existence as a species, we are told humans lived as nomadic hunter-gatherers in small bands, technologically simple, culturally limited, surviving but not thriving in the way we understand thriving today. And then approximately 10 to 12,000 years ago, something changed. Agriculture appeared almost simultaneously in several widely separated regions of the world, and with it came surplus settlement, specialization, hierarchy, writing cities, and everything we now call civilization. This narrative is clean and satisfying. It gives us a clear starting point and a clear trajectory, but it also rests on an assumption so deep that we rarely examine it, the assumption that absence of evidence is evidence of absence. Because we have not found the ruins of cities older than 10,000 years, we conclude that no such cities existed. Because we have not deciphered a writing system older than Sumerian cuneiform, we conclude that no such system was developed. Because the material record before the Holocene is sparse, we conclude that the people who lived in those millennia had nothing material worth recording. But the silence of the record, as we explored in the last chapter, does not necessarily mean the silence of the world. Consider what would survive of our own civilization if it were subjected to the same forces that have erased the deep past. Imagine our cities abandoned not for centuries but for 100,000 years. Steel would oxidize and collapse within decades. Glass would shatter and be ground to sand. Concrete would crack roots, would split it apart. Rain would dissolve its calcium back into the earth. Wood, paper, fabric, plastic, all of it would decompose or fragment beyond recognition within a few thousand years at most. Electronics would corrode into unidentifiable lumps of mineral. Even stone structures, the most durable things we build, would erode under the patient work of wind and water and freeze-thaw cycles until they became indistinguishable from natural rock formations. After 50,000 years, almost nothing recognizable would remain on the surface. After 100,000, a geologist examining the strata might find a thin layer of unusual chemical signatures, elevated carbon traces of synthetic compounds, perhaps a scattering of microplastics. But would they recognize it as the debris of a technological civilization, or would they catalogue it as an unexplained anomaly, a minor chemical perturbation? in an otherwise unremarkable sedimentary sequence and move on. This thought experiment is not fantasy. It is geology applied honestly to our own creations, and it reveals something uncomfortable. The window of preservation is far narrower than we like to believe. If a civilization existed 60 or 70,000 years ago, even one with significant social complexity, agricultural knowledge and architectural skill, but built primarily with organic materials, wood reed, woven fibre, unfired earth. It could have flourished for millennia and left virtually no trace that we would recognise today. The tropical and subtropical regions where early human populations were densest are also the regions where decomposition is fastest, where heat and moisture and microbial activity consume the evidence of habitation with extraordinary efficiency. A wooden temple in a tropical forest would be gone within a century. A city of mud brick would dissolve in a few thousand years of monsoon rain. Even stone, if it were not of exceptional hardness, or sheltered from weathering, would lose its work surfaces and become to all appearances just another boulder in a landscape full of boulders. The forgotten epoch is not necessarily an epoch where nothing happened. It may be an epoch where everything happened and nothing survived to testify. There are hints faint and debatable that the deep past was not as empty as we assume. Göbekli Tepe, discovered in southeastern Turkey and dated to approximately 11,600 years ago, pushed the known timeline of monumental architecture back by several thousand years and shattered the assumption that organised religion and large-scale construction required the prior development of agriculture and settled life. The people who built it were, as far as we can tell, hunter-gatherers, and yet they carved massive stone pillars, arranged them in precise circles, and decorated them with elaborate animal reliefs that suggest a symbolic and cosmological sophistication far beyond what the conventional timeline predicted. If one site can rewrite the narrative so dramatically, what might others do if they were found? And how many might lie beneath sea level, submerged by the 120-metre rise, in ocean levels that occurred as the ice sheets melted at the end of the last glacial period, coastal regions, which are precisely the areas where human populations tend to concentrate, would have been flooded slowly, but completely, over the course of several thousand years, carrying with them whatever was built along those ancient shorelines. We have barely begun to explore the continental shelves with the tools and funding necessary to detect submerged archaeological sites, and yet those shelves represent millions of square kilometres of formerly dry land that was inhabited for tens of thousands of years before the waters rose. The forgotten epoch is not a place on a map. It is a condition of the record itself, a reflection of the fact that time is not a museum but a recycling plant constantly breaking down the artefacts of one age to build the raw materials of the next. We stand at the end of a long hallway and look back, and because the lights only reach so far, we assume the hallway ends where the light does. But the hallway continues into the dark, and the dark is not empty. It is full of rooms we have not yet entered, full of stories written in materials that did not survive, full of lives as complex and as meaningful as our own, that simply had the misfortune of existing in a world that does not preserve its memories in stone. Tonight, as your breathing deepens and the edges of your thoughts begin to blur, let the forgotten epoch settle over you, not as a mystery to be solved, but as a presence to be felt. Somewhere behind the silence, behind the gaps in the record, behind the smooth, confident narrative of human progress, there is a depth we have not yet reached, and the earth, which has always known more than it reveals, holds that depth patiently, the way the ocean holds its floor, the way the dark holds its stars, waiting not for discovery, but simply continuing to exist whether anyone remembers or not. The earth has nearly died 5 times. Not in the poetic sense, not as metaphor, but in the blunt biological sense of losing almost everything alive on its surface. 5 times in the last 500 million years, the planet has passed through catastrophes so severe that the majority of species existing at the time were annihilated, their lineages cut short, their ecosystems collapsed, their futures cancelled in spans of time that by geological standards were almost instantaneous. We call these the Big 5 mass extinctions, and each one reads like the closing paragraph of a world that believed itself permanent. The Ordovician extinction 444 million years ago, when a sudden ice age froze the seas and killed roughly 85% of marine species. The late Devonian 370 million years ago, when the oceans lost oxygen, and entire reef systems vanished over a span of 20 million years. The Permian 252 million years ago, the worst of all, when volcanic eruptions in Siberia pumped enough carbon into the atmosphere to raise global temperatures by 10 degrees and wipe out over 90% of all species on Earth. The Triassic 201 million years ago, which cleared the stage for the rise of the dinosaurs, and the Cretaceous 66 million years ago, when an asteroid struck the Yucatan Peninsula and ended 150 million years of reptilian dominance in a single afternoon. 5 resets, 5 closings of the book, and 5 reopenings each time with a cast of characters that the previous world could never have predicted. But here is the part of the story that is easy to miss if you focus only on the destruction. Every reset was also a beginning. Not immediately, not painlessly, but inevitably. The Permian extinction, the Great Dying, killed nearly everything. And yet within 10 million years the Earth was teeming again, populated by new forms of life that had evolved to fill the emptied niches. The asteroid that ended the Cretaceous destroyed the dinosaurs, but it also liberated the mammals small and frightened, and hiding in burrows who would eventually diversify into whales, elephants, bats, primates, and us. Destruction on the planetary scale is not the opposite of creation. It is its prerequisite. The Earth does not destroy in order to punish. It destroys in order to breathe the way a forest burns so that new growth can reach the sunlight, the way a river floods so that the floodplain can receive fresh sediment and new fertility. The reset is not a malfunction in the system. The reset is the system. It is how the planet clears accumulated rigidity and opens space for experimentation, for novelty, for the next draft of life's ongoing manuscript. Think of it in terms of breathing. A long, slow inhale over millions of years, as ecosystems grow more complex, more interconnected, more specialized, filling every available niche with precisely adapted organisms that depend on one another in webs of increasing fragility. And then the exhale sudden or gradual as some disruption. Volcanic cosmic climatic pulls the thread that unravels the web. Species collapse, food chains dissolve. The biosphere simplifies, contracts, retreats to its most resilient forms, the microbes, the fungi, the deep-sea organisms that do not depend on sunlight or stable temperatures or the elaborate partnerships of surface life. And in that contracted state, in that silence, after the exhale, the planet rests. Not permanently, never permanently, but long enough for the chemistry to shift for the atmosphere, to rebalance for the ocean currents, to find new patterns for the raw materials of life to be reshuffled and made available again. And then the inhale begins once more slowly, tentatively, as survivors venture into emptied landscapes and begin the long work of building new ecosystems from the wreckage of the old. The rhythm is ancient, older than any species, older than any continent in its current form, and it shows no sign of stopping. What makes this rhythm difficult for us to accept is that we are almost certainly living inside one of its cycles right now. The current extinction rate, driven largely by human activity, is estimated to be between 100 and 1,000 times higher than the natural background rate. Species are vanishing faster than at any point since the asteroid impact 66 million years ago, and the drivers habitat destruction, climate change, pollution, overexploitation are accelerating rather than slowing. Some scientists have begun to call this the sixth extinction, and the name carries a weight that is hard to set down once you pick it up because it places our species not as the victim of the reset, but as its agent. We are not the asteroid. We are slower than that, more diffuse, more complicated in our motives. But the effect measured in the loss of biodiversity, in the collapse of insect populations, in the bleaching of coral reefs, in the shrinking of ice sheets, and the acidification of oceans, is converging towards something that the geological record would recognize, not as unprecedented, but as familiar, as another exhale in the long breathing of the planet. And yet, even if this is the beginning of a reset, the record tells us that resets are not endings. They are transitions. They are the planet's way of moving from one configuration to another, of testing new arrangements of chemistry and biology and climate, until a new stability emerges. The world after the Permian extinction was radically different, from the world before it populated by creatures that would have been unimaginable to the organisms that perished. The world after the Cretaceous impact was equally transformed, a mammalian world where the niches once held by giant reptiles were filled by warm-blooded milk, producing socially complex animals that would eventually produce a species capable of looking back at the record and understanding what had happened. Whatever comes after the current disruption, whether it is caused by us or merely accelerated by us, will be different again, shaped by conditions we cannot predict, and populated by forms of life we cannot yet imagine. The Earth does not repeat itself. It rhymes, returning to similar patterns but never to identical ones, each cycle a variation on a theme that has been playing for 4.5 billion years. So tonight, as you lie still, and the world outside your window continues its quiet turning, let the idea of the reset settle into you, not as a source of dread, but as a kind of deep geological reassurance. The planet has been through worse than us. It has survived the loss of 90% of its species, and come back richer, stranger, and more diverse than before. It will survive whatever we do to it, not because it is invulnerable, but because it is patient, and because its definition of survival is so much broader and so much more flexible than ours. We measure survival in human lifetimes in generations, in the persistence of our cities and our names. The Earth measures survival in the continuation of chemistry and the persistence of liquid water, in the ability of carbon to bond and rebond into new configurations of living matter. By that measure, the Earth has never failed, and by that measure the reset is not something to fear. It is simply the next breath. Nothing truly disappears. That is not a spiritual claim or a comforting platitude. It is a physical fact observable at every scale, from the subatomic to the planetary. Energy changes form but does not vanish. Matter reconfigures but does not cease. The calcium in a trilobite's shell becomes limestone, becomes cement, becomes the wall of a building, becomes dust, becomes calcium dissolved in groundwater, becomes the mineral content of a root vegetable, becomes part of a child's growing skeleton. The chain is unbroken not because someone designed it to be, but because the laws of conservation do not permit any other outcome. Nothing is created from nothing, and nothing returns to nothing. Everything that has ever existed on this planet continues to exist in altered form, scattered, recombined, woven into the fabric of what came after. This is what an echo is, not a repetition, but a reverberation, the past continuing to vibrate through the present in ways we rarely notice but can never fully escape. The Earth does not forget. It redistributes. And if you learn to listen for it, you can hear the echo of everything that came before still humming in the structure of the world around you. Start with your own body, because that is the echo closest to you tonight. You are made of approximately 7 octillion atoms, a number so large it has no intuitive meaning, and not one of those atoms was manufactured for you. Every single one of them existed before you were born, most of them long before billions of years before, forged in the cores of stars that exploded and scattered their contents across the galaxy before our solar system even formed. The iron in your blood was made in a dying star. The oxygen you're breathing was released by cyanobacteria in an ancient ocean. The phosphorus in your DNA was part of the mineral content of rocks that eroded into rivers that fed soils that grew plants that fed animals, that eventually, through an unimaginably long chain of consumption and decomposition, contributed their atoms to the body you inhabit now. You are not a new thing. You are a reconfiguration of very old things, a temporary arrangement of materials that have been in circulation for longer than the Earth itself has existed. Your body is an echo of stellar explosions, of ancient metabolisms, of chemical reactions that took place in the darkness of deep space before there was a planet here to catch the fallout. When you breathe tonight, you are participating in a cycle that began before the sun ignited. When your heart beats, it moves iron that was once at the center of a collapsing star. The echo is not outside you, it is you. But the echo extends far beyond biology. It runs through culture, through architecture, through the unconscious habits of civilizations that believe themselves to be original, but are in almost every case recombinations of patterns that have appeared before. Consider the arch, one of the oldest structural forms in human construction, appearing independently in Mesopotamia, in Egypt, in Mesoamerica, in Rome, in medieval Europe, and in modern engineering. The arch is not an invention. that was passed from one culture to another in every case. It is a solution that the physics of gravity and compression imposes on any species that tries to span an opening with rigid materials. The shape recurs not because of cultural transmission, but because of structural necessity, because stone and brick and concrete all obey the same laws, and those laws have a preference for curves that distribute weight efficiently. The arch is an echo of gravity itself, a physical principle, expressing itself through the hands of builders who may never have heard of one another, but who all lived on the same planet under the same downward pull. Architecture in this sense is not purely human. It is a collaboration between human intention and planetary physics, and the planet's contribution is always older, always deeper, always more fundamental than the architect's. Language carries its own echoes, ones that linguists have traced back thousands of years through the branching trees of related tongues. The word for mother in nearly every language on Earth begins with a nasal consonant, an M sound, not because of some universal etymology, but because of the physiology of infants, whose first vocalizations while nursing naturally produce that sound, and whose caregivers across every culture and every era have interpreted that sound as a name for themselves. The echo here is not linguistic, but biological, rooted in the shape of the human mouth and the mechanics of breastfeeding, a pattern so old and so deeply embedded in our species that it predates every language that has ever been spoken. When a child says mama today in any country in any tongue, they are producing an echo that stretches back to the first Homo sapiens mothers who heard the same sound and responded to it with the same instinctive recognition. The word has changed in its surfaces, translated and adapted across 10,000 languages, but its root is the same breath, the same movement of lips, the same biological signal sent from infant to caregiver, in the dark of a cave or a hut or a hospital room unchanged for 300,000 years. Even our fears carry echoes. The near universal human fear of snakes present even in cultures where venomous snakes are absent, and in infants too young to have learned the association is believed to be an evolutionary inheritance from our primate ancestors, who lived in environments where recognizing and avoiding serpents was a matter of survival. That fear is not rational in the modern sense. It is not based on personal experience or calculated risk. It is an echo of a world that no longer exists for most of us, a world of forest floors and tall grass, where the difference between alertness and inattention was the difference between life and death. Your nervous system carries the memory of that world even though you have never lived in it. When your pulse quickens at the sight of a coiled shape in the corner of your vision, you are responding not to the present, but to a past so deep it has become indistinguishable from instinct. The echo does not ask permission to reverberate. It simply does because the body remembers what the conscious mind has long since forgotten. The planet itself echoes in ways we are only beginning to measure. Seismic waves from earthquakes travel through the Earth's interior and bounce off layers of differing density, creating patterns that geophysicists use to map the structure of the mantle and core. But those waves also carry information about the history of the planet's formation, about the differentiation of heavy and light elements billions of years ago, about ancient impacts that left density anomalies deep below the surface. The Earth rings literally after a major earthquake, vibrating at frequencies too low for human hearing, but detectable by sensitive instruments, and those vibrations can persist for weeks. The planet humming to itself like a bell struck in an empty cathedral. The echo of a single seismic event travels through rock and metal and liquid iron, reflecting and refracting, and gradually dissipating into heat, but never truly vanishing, only becoming quieter, folding itself into the background noise of a planet that has been vibrating since it first condensed from a disk of gas and dust 4.5 billion years ago. You are living on the surface of an echo. Everything beneath you is still ringing with the memory of its own formation, and everything above you, the air, the light, the slow drift of clouds, is shaped by forces that began before any living thing existed to witness them. Tonight you are part of that resonance, your breathing, adding its own small frequency to the hum of a planet that has never, not once in its entire history, been silent. There is a moment in every long observation when the individual data points stop being separate and begin to form a shape. It does not happen suddenly. It happens the way a constellation emerges from a sky full of stars, not because the stars have moved, but because the eye has finally relaxed enough to stop focusing on each one individually, and has begun instead to perceive the spaces between them, the relationships, the geometry that was always there, but required a certain softness of attention to become visible. That is what happens when you look at the history of the Earth long enough. The events stop being isolated, the extinctions, the rebirths, the slow risings and rapid collapses, and they begin to arrange themselves into something that is not quite repetition but is undeniably rhythmic, a pattern, not a perfect one, not a mechanical cycle that repeats with clockwork precision, but a deep structural tendency, a preference that the planet seems to have for certain kinds of sequences, certain kinds of arcs, certain ways of building complexity and then releasing it back into simplicity before building again. The pattern is not a law, it is a habit. And habits, as anyone who has tried to break one knows, are among the most powerful forces in existence. The simplest version of the pattern is this accumulation followed by disruption, followed by renewal. It appears at every scale. At the scale of ecosystems where forests grow dense and layered over centuries until a fire or a storm strips them back to open ground, and then the process of succession begins again, first with grasses and mosses, then with shrubs, then with small trees, then with the tall canopy species that will eventually recreate the density that invites the next disruption. At the scale of geology, where tectonic plates converge to build supercontinents that persist for hundreds of millions of years before rifting apart again, scattering their fragments across the globe, in a cycle that has repeated at least 5 times in Earth's history, each time rearranging the oceans, the climates, and the distribution of life. At the scale of biology, where species diversify and specialize and fill every available niche until the system becomes so finely tuned that a single perturbation, a shift in temperature, a change in sea level, the arrival of a new predator can trigger a cascade of collapses that simplifies the web and opens space for new lineages to evolve. The pattern is fractal, self-similar across scales, the same basic shape, appearing whether you are looking at a single forest clearing or at the entire biosphere over 500 million years. Civilizations follow this pattern too, and this is where it begins to feel personal, because we are not observing the pattern from outside. We are inside it, living through one of its iterations, unable to see the full shape because we are too close to the canvas. But if you step back far enough, the rhythm becomes unmistakable. Mesopotamia accumulated complexity for thousands of years, developing writing, mathematics, irrigation law, and centralized governance, until a combination of environmental degradation, salinization of farmland, and external military pressure disrupted the system, and its city-states collapsed, or were absorbed into new empires that began the cycle again. Rome accumulated for centuries, building roads, aqueducts, legal systems, and military infrastructure of astonishing sophistication, until overextension, economic strain, political corruption, and the pressure of migrating peoples triggered a long, slow unravelling that eventually gave way to the fragmented but fertile landscape of medieval Europe, where new forms of governance, religion, and technology emerged from the wreckage. The Maya, the Khmer, the Indus Valley civilization, the Western Zhou, the list extends across every continent and every millennium, and the shape is always recognizable even when the details differ. Accumulation, disruption, renewal. The pattern does not care about the names of the civilizations it carries. It does not distinguish between empires and villages. It simply moves the way a wave moves through water, rising, cresting, breaking, and rising again. What makes this pattern so difficult for humans to accept is that we experience time linearly. We live inside the arrow of our own mortality, moving from birth to death in a single direction, and we project that linearity onto everything around us. We imagine history as a line moving from primitive to advanced, from ignorance to knowledge, from weakness to strength. We call this progress, and we measure it by the accumulation of technology, of comfort, of control over our environment. But the pattern suggests something different. It suggests that what we call progress is actually the accumulation phase of a cycle, and that the disruption phase, when it comes, is not a failure of progress, but an inherent feature of the system that produced it. The more complex a system becomes, the more vulnerable it is to disruption, because complexity requires coordination, and coordination requires stability, and stability is never permanent on a planet that is constantly shifting, heating, cooling, erupting, and rearranging its surface. Progress in the deep time view is not a destination, it is a season, and seasons by their nature turn. This is not a counsel of despair. Recognizing the pattern does not mean surrendering to it. It means understanding the terrain you are moving through, the way a sailor understands currents and weather patterns, not to control them but to navigate them more wisely. If civilizations inevitably face disruption, then the question is not how to prevent disruption, but how to build resilience, how to create systems that can absorb shocks without shattering entirely, how to preserve knowledge and culture through periods of contraction so that the renewal phase begins from a higher baseline rather than from scratch. Some civilizations have done this better than others. China, for example, has passed through multiple cycles of dynastic rise and collapse over 4,000 years. Yet each new dynasty inherited a cultural and technological foundation from the one before, creating a continuity that persisted even through periods of devastating upheaval. The knowledge was not lost. It was carried sometimes in books, sometimes in oral tradition, sometimes in the muscle memory of craftspeople and farmers who continued their work regardless of which emperor sat on the throne. The pattern moved through them, but they moved through it too, carrying seeds from one season into the next. Tonight, lying, still breathing slowly, you can feel the pattern in your own body if you let yourself. The rise and fall of your chest, the systole and diastole of your heart. The cycle of waking and sleeping that governs every day of your life. You are not separate from the rhythm that moves through ecosystems and civilizations and geological ages. You are an expression of it, a single oscillation in a wave that has been moving since the planet formed. The pattern does not ask you to be permanent. It asks you only to participate, to rise, when it is time to rise, to rest, when it is time to rest, and to trust that the rhythm will continue even when your own small contribution to it has ended. History is not a line, it is a breath, and you are breathing it now. The earth does not shout, it has never needed to. Its warnings arrive the way all deep signals do, not as alarms, but as shifts, subtle changes in rhythm that are easy to miss if you are not paying attention, and easy to dismiss if you are paying attention, but would prefer not to believe what you are hearing. A glacier does not crack overnight. It thins over decades, losing mass so gradually that the loss is invisible to anyone standing on its surface, measurable only by instruments precise enough to detect a change of millimeters per year across a body of ice that spans hundreds of kilometers. A coral reef does not die in a single event. It bleaches, recovers partially, bleaches again, recovers less, bleaches a third time, and does not recover at all, and the entire process can take 20 or 30 years, long enough that each stage feels like its own isolated instant rather than a step in a progression that has been underway since before you first heard the word reef. The warning is always there, it is always early, and it is almost always quiet enough to ignore, which is precisely what makes it dangerous. Because by the time the signal becomes loud enough that no one can pretend they do not hear it, the window for response is usually already closed. The geological record is full of these warnings, preserved in the chemistry of ancient rocks and the distribution of ancient fossils, and in every case the story follows the same arc. A slow shift in baseline conditions, a period of apparent stability that is actually a period of accumulating stress, and then a tipping point beyond which the system reorganizes rapidly and irreversibly into a new state. The Permian extinction, the worst in Earth's history, did not begin with the eruption of the Siberian traps. It began millions of years earlier with a gradual warming of the oceans, a slow decline in dissolved oxygen, a subtle shift in the carbon cycle that would have been detectable to anyone with the instruments to measure it, but that produced no visible catastrophe until the volcanic eruptions added a final massive pulse of carbon dioxide to an atmosphere that was already under strain. The system had been sending warnings for millions of years. The eruptions were not the cause of the extinction. They were the last push on a structure that was already leaning. The cause was the accumulation of stress that preceded them, the long, slow, quiet deterioration that no organism alive at the time could have perceived because it was happening on a timescale that exceeded any individual lifespan by orders of magnitude. The same pattern appears in the lead up to the end Cretaceous extinction. The asteroid impact 66 million years ago is dramatic and easy to point to a single catastrophic event with a clear before and after. But the ecosystems that collapsed in its aftermath were not at their peak of resilience when the asteroid struck. The late Cretaceous was already a period of environmental stress with massive volcanic eruptions. In what is now India, the Deccan traps, releasing greenhouse gases and altering ocean chemistry for hundreds of thousands of years before the impact. Sea levels were fluctuating. Some dinosaur populations were already in decline. The asteroid did not destroy a thriving world. It delivered a killing blow to a world that was already weakened, already receiving warnings in the form of shifting temperatures, changing sea chemistry, and declining biodiversity. The lesson is always the same. The catastrophe that ends an era is rarely the first signal of trouble. It is the last one, the one that arrives after all the quieter warnings have been absorbed, adapted to, or ignored. Today the warnings are arriving again, and they are arriving in a language that the geological record would recognize instantly. Ocean temperatures are rising not dramatically in any single year, but consistently year after year, each decade warmer than the last, each measurement a fraction of a degree higher than the one before, accumulating into a trend that is now unmistakable. Arctic sea ice is declining, not vanishing all at once, but thinning and shrinking, in a pattern that mirrors the slow losses recorded in ice cores from previous warming events. Insect populations are falling across every continent, a signal so quiet and so easy to overlook that it went largely unnoticed for decades, until researchers began comparing current surveys with historical baselines and discovered that biomass had declined by 60 or 70% in some regions within a single human generation. Coral reefs are bleaching with increasing frequency, each event pushing the recovery window shorter, each recovery less complete than the last. Permafrost in Siberia and Alaska is thawing, releasing methane that has been locked in frozen soil for tens of thousands of years, adding a feedback loop to a warming cycle that is already accelerating. None of these signals is new. All of them have precedence in the geological record, and in every previous case the trajectory they describe led not to gentle correction but to fundamental reorganization of the planetary system. The difficulty is not in reading the warnings. The difficulty is in feeling them, in translating data measured in parts per million and fractions of degrees into something the human nervous system recognizes as urgent. We are built to respond to immediate threats, to the rustle in the grass that might be a predator, to the crack of a branch that might signal danger, to the sharp spike of adrenaline that tells us to move now. We are not built to respond to threats that accumulate over decades, that express themselves in statistical trends, rather than sensory experiences that require not a burst of action, but a sustained, coordinated, multi-generational change in behavior. The mismatch between the speed of the warning and the speed of our perception is not a flaw in the warning. It is a flaw in us, a limitation of the same nervous system that kept our ancestors alive on the savannah, but that struggles to process information arriving on timescales longer than a single lifetime. The Earth is not failing to communicate. We are failing to listen at the right frequency, and perhaps that is the gentlest way to hold this knowledge tonight, not as accusation, but as recognition. The warnings are real. They are consistent with every previous episode of planetary transition recorded in the rock and ice and sediment. They do not guarantee catastrophe because the future is not written, and the choices we make still matter, but they do indicate that the system is under stress, that the baseline is shifting, that the ground beneath the story we tell ourselves about stability and permanence is not as firm as it feels. The Earth has been here before, it has sent these signals before, and every time without exception the signals were followed by change, not gentle correction, but deep structural reorganization that redefined the planet's surface, its atmosphere, its oceans, and the community of living things that depended on all three. The warning is not a prophecy. It is an observation offered without judgment, without urgency, without emotion, because the Earth does not experience urgency or emotion. It simply records what is happening, writes it into its layers and waits. It has always waited. It is waiting now. And tonight, in the stillness of wherever you are, you can feel it waiting if you let yourself the way you feel the pause between one breath and the next, the quiet space where the inhale has ended, and the exhale has not yet begun, the moment where everything is balanced and nothing has yet been decided. Look up. Not now, not literally, but in the theatre of your mind. Let the ceiling dissolve and the roof peel back and the atmosphere thin until you are looking at the sky, as it truly is not a blue dome or a black curtain, but an opening, an infinite corridor extending outward in every direction from the thin shell of gas that keeps you alive. You have spent your whole life at the bottom of an ocean of air looking up through it, the way a fish looks up through water, seeing light and colour and movement, but never quite grasping the depth of what lies beyond the surface. Tonight, let yourself rise through that surface and see what has always been there, the ancient and ongoing conversation between the sky above and the ground beneath, between the stars that built the raw materials of this planet, and the geology that arranged those materials into mountains, oceans, continents, and eventually into the fragile, temporary, astonishing thing called life. Because the Earth did not make itself. It was made by the sky, and everything that happens on its surface, every eruption, every extinction, every civilization that rises and falls is a continuation of processes that began not here, but out there in the dark between the stars. The elements that compose the Earth were forged in stellar furnaces billions of years before the solar system existed. Hydrogen, the simplest and oldest element, was born in the first minutes after the Big Bang, when the universe was still a hot, dense fog of energy cooling rapidly into matter. But hydrogen alone does not build planets or bones or oceans. For that you need heavier elements, carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, iron, silicon, calcium, phosphorus, and these were manufactured inside stars cooked in the crushing pressure and temperature of stellar cores, where hydrogen atoms were fused together into progressively heavier nuclei over millions of years. When those stars exhausted their fuel and collapsed, the largest of them exploded as supernova, scattering their enriched material across light years of space in expanding shells of gas and dust. That debris mingled with existing clouds of hydrogen, seeding them with the heavy elements necessary for rocky planets, for liquid water, for the chemistry of life. Our solar system formed from one such cloud approximately 4.5 billion years ago, and every atom of iron in the Earth's core, every molecule of water in its oceans, every grain of silicate in its mantle, was delivered by that ancient stellar inheritance. The ground you are lying on tonight is made of dead stars. That is not poetry. That is chemistry. The relationship between sky and Earth did not end with the planet's formation. It continues every day in ways both subtle and profound, shaping the conditions that make life possible and occasionally threatening to end it. The sun, our nearest star, drives the climate system that distributes heat and moisture across the globe, powering the winds that erode mountains, the currents that circulate nutrients through the oceans, and the evaporation that lifts water from the sea and returns it as rain to feed rivers and forests, and the slow, patient work of soil formation. Without the sun's energy, the surface of the Earth would be frozen solid within weeks, the oceans locked under ice, the atmosphere itself beginning to condense and fall as frost. Everything alive on this planet exists because a star 93 million miles away is burning through 4 million tons of hydrogen every second, converting mass into energy at a rate that has remained remarkably stable for billions of years, but that will not remain stable forever. The sun is aging. In roughly 5 billion years, it will exhaust its hydrogen fuel, expand into a red giant that engulfs the inner planets, and eventually shed its outer layers into space, leaving behind a dense cooling remnant called a white dwarf. The Earth's story, long as it is, has an expiration date written in the life cycle of its parent star. The sky giveth, and the sky will eventually take away. But the conversation is not one-directional. The Earth speaks back to the sky in ways that are easy to overlook because they happen so slowly. Volcanic eruptions inject aerosols and gases into the upper atmosphere, altering the amount of sunlight that reaches the surface, and sometimes cooling the entire planet for years at a time. The eruption of Mount Tambora in 1815 lowered global temperatures enough to cause crop failures across Europe and North America the following year, a period known as the Year Without a Summer, when frost struck in June and snow fell in August, and the sky took on a strange, persistent haze that painters of the era captured without understanding its cause. On longer time scales the slow outgassing of carbon dioxide from volcanic activity, and the equally slow drawdown of carbon by weathering and biological processes have regulated the Earth's temperature over billions of years, maintaining conditions within the narrow range that allows liquid water to persist on the surface. This is not a thermostat in the mechanical sense. There is no dial, no set point, no conscious regulation. It is a feedback system, a conversation between the planet's interior and its atmosphere mediated by chemistry and time, and it has kept the Earth habitable through conditions that would have sterilized a less responsive world. The sky and the Earth are not separate systems. They are two voices in a single ongoing dialogue, each one shaping the other across timescales that dwarf every human institution. The stars also send messengers that arrive without warning and with consequences that can reshape the planet in an instant. Asteroids and comets, remnants of the solar system's formation, still drift through the inner solar system on orbits that occasionally intersect the Earth's path. The impact that ended the Cretaceous period 66 million years ago was delivered by a body roughly 10 kilometers across, traveling at perhaps 20 kilometers per second, and the energy released was equivalent to several billion nuclear weapons detonating simultaneously. The sky in that moment reached down and rewrote the biological history of the planet in a single stroke. It was not the first such rewriting, and it will not be the last, because the solar system is not empty, and the Earth's orbit is not a protected lane. Smaller impacts occur more frequently, large enough to devastate regions but not to trigger global extinctions, and the geological record preserves their craters as circular scars that erode slowly over millions of years, but never quite disappear. The sky is not a ceiling. It is a frontier open and active and occasionally violent, and the Earth has always existed in relationship with it, receiving its energy, its materials, its disruptions, and incorporating all of them into the ongoing story of its surface. Tonight, as your body settles deeper into stillness, and the boundary between waking and sleep begins to soften, let yourself hold this image. You're lying on a planet made of stardust, warmed by a star that is slowly dying, orbiting through a galaxy that is drifting through an expanding universe that has no center and no edge. The ground beneath you is not separate from the sky above you. They are the same material rearranged by gravity and time into the temporary configuration you call home. The iron in your blood and the iron in the Earth's core came from the same stellar explosion. The oxygen in your lungs and the oxygen bound into the silicate rocks of the mantle were delivered by the same ancient cloud of interstellar debris. You're not on the Earth, you're of it, and the Earth is of the sky, and the sky is of a process so old and so vast that the word beginning barely applies. You're made of the conversation between sky and Earth, and that conversation did not start with you, and will not end with you. It will continue as it always has in the language of light and gravity, and chemistry spoken across distances and durations that no single voice can span, but that every voice, however briefly, joins. There is a feeling that comes sometimes without explanation, a sense that you have been somewhere before, not in the literal sense of having visited a place, but in a deeper, less definable way, as though the shape of a moment, the quality of a light, the angle of a shadow on a wall, has triggered something in you that is not memory exactly, but resembles memory so closely that the distinction dissolves. You stand at the edge of the sea, and something in the rhythm of the waves feels not just familiar but ancient, as though your body recognizes a tempo it has no conscious reason to know. You watch a fire, and the way the flames move produces not just warmth, but a kind of stillness in your chest, a settling, as if some very old part of you has been waiting for exactly this light in exactly this darkness. You hear wind moving through tall grass, and for a moment you're not in the present at all, but somewhere else, someone else, in a landscape you have never seen, but that your nervous system seems to remember with a clarity that your mind cannot explain. This is the return. Not a return to a specific place or a specific time, but a return to a pattern, a rhythm, a configuration of sensory information that has repeated so many times across the history of your species that it has become embedded not in your thoughts but in your tissue and your breath, in the architecture of your attention itself. The cycles of the natural world are not metaphors for repetition. They are repetition, literal and physical, encoded into the planet's behavior by the mechanics of orbit, tilt and rotation. The Earth has been spinning on its axis for 4.5 billion years, producing day and night with a regularity that has never once faltered, though the days were shorter in the distant past and will be longer in the distant future, as tidal friction gradually slows the rotation. The planet has been orbiting the Sun for the same span of time, producing seasons as its tilted axis alternates. Which hemisphere receives more direct sunlight? A cycle so reliable that every living organism on the surface has evolved in response to it. Timing reproduction, migration, dormancy and growth to the predictable swing of light and temperature that the orbit provides. These are not human cycles, they are planetary ones, and every creature that has ever lived from the first cyanobacterium to the last human who will ever draw breath has existed inside them, shaped by them, dependent on them in ways that range from the obvious to the profoundly subtle. When you feel sleepy as the light fades, you're not making a decision. You're obeying a rhythm that predates your species by billions of years. When your mood lifts in spring and dims in winter, you're responding to the same orbital mechanics that drive the melting of glaciers and the blooming of plankton in polar seas. You're not separate from the cycle. You're one of its instruments playing a part you did not compose, but that fits you perfectly because you were built by it. The return is visible in the geological record as well, in patterns that repeat across hundreds of millions of years, with variations but never with true novelty. Ice ages come and go in cycles driven by subtle fluctuations in the Earth's orbit known as Lankovich cycles, which alter the amount and distribution of solar energy reaching the planet's surface over periods of roughly 26,000, 41,000 and 100,000 years. These cycles have been operating for as long as the Earth has had an axial tilt, which is to say for its entire history, and they will continue to operate for as long as the planet orbits the Sun. The ice advances, the ice retreats, the sea level falls, the sea level rises. Coastlines migrate inland and then withdraw again. Forests spread north and then retreat south. The pattern is not identical each time because the position of the continents changes, the composition of the atmosphere shifts, and the community of living organisms evolves, but the fundamental rhythm is the same, a slow oscillation between cold and warm, between expansion and contraction, between accumulation and release. And the Earth has been breathing this way for billions of years. What we experience as climate, as weather, as the stable backdrop of our brief lives is actually a single frame in an animation that has been running since the planet formed a single note in a chord that has been sustaining itself across deep time without interruption. Human cultures echo this return in ways that are so universal, they suggest something deeper than tradition. Nearly every civilization in recorded history has organized its spiritual and social life around cycles of death and rebirth, around the idea that what ends will come again in a new form. The agricultural festivals of ancient Mesopotamia celebrated the return of fertility after the barren months. The Egyptian myth of Osiris, dismembered and reassembled, mapped the annual flooding of the Nile and the renewal of the soil. The Hindu concept of yugas describes vast cosmic cycles of creation, preservation and dissolution, each one giving way to the next in a rhythm that has no beginning and no end. The Christian narrative of resurrection, the Buddhist wheel of samsara, the indigenous Australian understanding of the dreamtime as an eternal present that continuously generates the world, all of these are cultural expressions of a pattern that the planet itself enacts physically, chemically, biologically, without intention and without interruption. We did not invent the idea of cyclical return. We observed it, felt it in our bodies and our harvests and our losses, and then we told stories about it, because storytelling is how humans make sense of patterns too large to hold in a single mind. The stories differ in their details, but the shape beneath them is always the same because the shape is not cultural. It is planetary. It is cosmic. It belongs to the physics of a universe that does not move in straight lines, but in spirals, in orbits, in oscillations that return and return and return without ever arriving at a final destination. Tonight, as your breathing slows and the weight of consciousness begins to thin, you're entering your own small return. Sleep is not absence. It is a cycle, one you've repeated thousands of times, and will repeat thousands more each time, descending into a state that resembles in its deepest phases something very close to the stillness of the planet itself. Your muscles release, your temperature drops, your brain shifts from the sharp linear processing of waking thought into slower, broader patterns that wash across the cortex like tides across a shore. Dreams emerge not as narratives constructed by a waking mind, but as the brain's own version of geological sorting, consolidating memories, dissolving what is no longer needed, strengthening what must be carried forward. You have done this every night of your life, and every morning you return not as the same person exactly, but as a variation, a new draft written on the template of the old, carrying forward what the cycle has chosen to preserve and releasing what it has chosen to let go. The return is not a repetition, it is a renewal, and it is happening to you right now as the rhythm of the planet and the rhythm of your body converge into the same slow, downward arc. Let it carry you. It has been carrying everything on this planet for longer than memory, longer than stone, longer than light from the nearest star. The return does not need your permission. It only needs your willingness to stop resisting it, to let the cycle close, to trust that what descends will rise again, as it always has, as it always will. So here we are at the end of a journey that has carried us from the floor of an ancient rainforest to the silence of Antarctic ice, from the chemistry of sediment to the furnace of dying stars, from the forgotten epochs buried beneath our feet to the slow planetary breath that has been rising and falling since before anything alive existed to notice it. We have travelled billions of years tonight without moving from wherever you are lying, and the distance we have covered is not measured in kilometres but in perspective, in the quiet shift that happens when you stop seeing yourself as the centre of the story and begin to see yourself as a sentence within it, a brief and luminous sentence in a book that has been writing itself for longer than any mind can hold. The question we began with was whether humanity is the pinnacle of life on Earth, or simply a phase, and the honest answer, the one that the rocks and the ice and the fossils and the stars all converge upon, is that we are a phase. Not a lesser phase, not an unimportant one, but a temporary one, as every phase before us has been temporary, and as every phase after us will be. The trilobites were a phase. The great forests of the Carboniferous were a phase. The dinosaurs, magnificent and enduring as they were ruling for a span of time that dwarfs our own, by orders of magnitude were a phase. The Earth does not play favourites. It does not assign permanence to any of its inhabitants. It simply provides the stage shift, the lighting, and waits to see what emerges. And what emerges is always extraordinary, always temporary, always eventually replaced by something equally extraordinary that could not have existed without the disappearance of what came before. But knowing that you are temporary does not diminish you. This is the part that matters most, and it is the part that is easiest to forget in the weight of geological time. A sunset is not less beautiful because it lasts only minutes. A song is not less moving because it ends. A life is not less meaningful because the species that produced it will one day vanish from the fossil record. Meaning is not a function of duration. It is a function of presence, of the quality of attention, brought to the moment of the depth with which an experience is felt and shared and carried. You are here now, aware, breathing, listening, thinking thoughts that no other arrangement of atoms in the history of the universe has ever thought in quite this way. That is not small, that is not insignificant, that is the universe doing something it almost never does, which is noticing itself, and it is doing it through you tonight in whatever room or darkness or quiet you have found. The earth will continue after us. The forests will return where we have cleared them. The oceans will rebalance their chemistry over millennia. New species will evolve to fill the niches we leave empty, and some of them may develop awareness of their own, may look up at the same stars we mapped, and wonder the same questions we wondered and never suspect that someone was here before them asking the same things in different words. The story does not end with us. It does not depend on us. But for this one brief chapter, it includes us, and that inclusion is a gift so improbable and so fleeting that the only appropriate response is not grief but gratitude. Gratitude not for permanence, which was never offered, but for presence, which is all any living thing has ever truly had. Let that settle now. Let it rest in you the way sediment rests on the ocean floor, slowly, gently, without urgency. You do not need to solve the mystery of deep time. You do not need to secure your place in the geological record. You do not need to be anything more than what you are in this moment, which is a conscious being lying still on the surface of a planet that has been patient enough to produce you and will be patient enough to continue without you. The calcium in your bones will return to the earth. The iron in your blood will rejoin the slow cycle of mineral and water and stone. The breath you are taking now will be exhaled and mixed into an atmosphere that has been shared by every living thing for 4.5 billion years. You're not losing anything by being temporary. You're participating in everything by being here. Close your eyes if they are not already closed. Let the last threads of thought loosen and drift. The earth is holding you the way it has always held its inhabitants, not with hands, but with gravity, not with intention, but with patience, not with promises of forever, but with the quiet certainty that the story continues, that the page will turn, that something new will always emerge from what has passed. You are part of that emergence. You always have been. And even as sleep carries you now into its own gentle cycle of descent and return, the planet beneath you keeps writing, keeps breathing, keeps turning its face toward the stars that made it unhurried, unfinished, and endlessly, beautifully alive. We've reached the edge of tonight's journey, traveller. The path behind us stretches far through rainforests where rain takes 7 minutes to reach the ground, through ice that holds the breath of worlds no one remembers, through the silence of erased epochs, and the slow geological exhale of resets that cleared the stage for everything that followed. We walked through echoes written in your blood and bones, through patterns older than any civilization, through warnings carried in the chemistry of oceans, through the conversation between dying stars and the ground beneath your back. It was a long road, and none of it needs to be remembered. Not consciously, not tonight. The words have already done their work. They have settled into you the way sediment settles through deep water, slowly without effort, finding their place in layers you will not examine, but that will hold you nonetheless. You do not need to recall a single sentence. The weight of what was shared is already resting in the quiet architecture beneath your thoughts, where understanding lives without language and knowing lives without proof. In the end, traveller, it is all right to not understand. It is all right to hold questions the way the ocean holds stones without needing to open them, without needing to see what is inside. Some things are meant to be carried, not solved. Some things are meant to be felt, not explained. And tonight you have carried enough. Let gravity hold you. Let the questions fade. Let your body return to the oldest rhythm it knows, the one that was here before you, and will continue long after the slow turning of a planet that does not rush and does not forget. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, only observed. Tonight the universe whispers again. Sleep, traveller. The cosmos will keep watch.